In exactly 208 seconds, 155 lives were pushed to the edge of a frozen eternity. Picture the scene. A routine climb, a violent explosion of feathers, and then a deafening, library-like silence at 3,000 feet. As the Manhattan skyline begins to tower over the aircraft, the captain's voice crackles over the PA with 3 final words. Brace for impact. Below lies the Hudson River, a 36-degree icy tomb waiting to swallow Flight 1549 whole. This is the heartbeat-by-heartbeat story of the miracle on the Hudson. Stick around, because the split-second decisions made in this cockpit didn't just save lives, they changed the world of aviation forever. Imagine for a moment that you are sitting in a pressurized metal tube, hurtling through the sky at 250 miles per hour. Below you, the jagged, glittering skyline of Manhattan stretches out like a field of glass. It is a routine Thursday. You are thinking about your meeting in Charlotte, your kids' soccer practice, or the biting cold waiting for you back on the ground. You have no idea that in exactly 90 seconds, the laws of physics and the predictability of your life are going to collide with the raw, unyielding power of nature. You are about to become a passenger on US Airways Flight 1549, and your survival will depend on a series of decisions made in less time than it takes to boil a pot of water. The afternoon of January 15th, 2009 was a masterpiece of winter cruelty. The air temperature in New York City was a bone-chilling 19 degrees Fahrenheit. The Hudson River, a dark tidal ribbon separating the skyscrapers from the industrial shores of New Jersey, was a frigid 36 degrees, a temperature that doesn't just feel cold, it feels like a physical assault. For the 150 passengers boarding the Airbus A320 at LaGuardia, the objective was mundane, a flight home. They moved through the gate with the rhythmic, unthinking confidence of modern travelers, unaware they were stepping into the most scrutinized 4 minutes in aviation history. In the cockpit, Captain Chesley Sully Sullenberger, a man with nearly 20,000 hours of flight time and a lifetime of safety expertise, sat beside First Officer Jeffrey Skiles. Ironically, it was Skiles' first trip in an A320 without an instructor after a decade on different aircraft. They were strangers who had met only 3 days prior. Yet they were about to perform a choreographed dance of survival. At 3:24 p.m., the engines roared to life, generating the massive thrust needed to lift the 150,000-pound aircraft into the frozen sky. As they climbed through 700 feet, Sullenberger looked out at the sprawling urban landscape and remarked, "What a view of the Hudson today." It was a casual observation of beauty that would, in less than 2 minutes, transform into a desperate assessment of a landing strip. Then, at 3:27 p.m., the world shifted. At 2,818 feet, a massive V formation of Canada geese appeared in the windscreen. There was no time to maneuver. At 250 miles per hour, the birds and the plane were closing in on each other at over 360 feet per second. The sound was not a splash, but a succession of violent, rhythmic thuds. Boom, 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 as birds weighing up to 12 pounds each were sucked into the engines. Inside the cabin, passengers heard the bangs and saw orange flames trailing from the engines. Then, something far more terrifying happened. Silence. The high-pitched whine of the jet engines was replaced by an eerie, fluttering deceleration, a sound Skiles described as pshh, as both engines rolled back to idle. The smell followed almost instantly, the pungent, sickening odor of unburned jet fuel and cooked biological matter. It was the smell of mortality. Flight 1549 was no longer a jet. It was a 75-ton glider. In the Air Traffic Control Center, Patrick Harton was handling the routine flow of New York's busy airspace when Sullenberger's voice crackled over his headset. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday! This is Cactus 1539. Hit birds. We've lost thrust on both engines. We're turning back towards LaGuardia." Harton, a 10-year veteran, immediately felt the weight of the moment. He halted all departures and tried to find a path home for the crippled plane. He offered runway 13. Sullenberger's response was chillingly brief. "Unable." Harton offered runway 4. "Unable," Sullenberger repeated. The calculations in the cockpit were happening at the speed of thought. The A320 has a glide ratio of approximately approximately 17 to 1, meaning for every 1,000 feet of altitude, it can glide about 2.8 miles forward. At 2,800 feet, Sullenberger knew he didn't have the energy to make it back to LaGuardia. He asked about Teterboro in New Jersey. Harton quickly coordinated a runway there, but as the plane glided lower, passing just 900 feet over the George Washington Bridge, so low that people on the ground could read the lettering on the fuselage, Sullenberger realized that Teterboro was also a gamble they would lose. If they fell short, they would plow into the densely populated neighborhoods of Bergen County. At 3:29:28 p.m., Sullenberger made the final, irrevocable decision. "We're going to be in the Hudson." Harton, unable to wrap his mind around the concept of an Airbus ditching in the middle of Manhattan, asked him to repeat it. He believed he was hearing a death sentence for everyone on board. He was sure he would be the last person to speak to them alive. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was one of heavy, electric silence. Passenger Elizabeth McHugh watched as the skyscrapers of the West Side began to grow taller and taller, realized they were no longer climbing, and accepted she was going to die. In the back, flight attendant Doreen Welsh saw smoke drifting through the cabin. Then, Sullenberger's voice came over the PA. It wasn't a speech. It was 3 words that would haunt the survivors for years. "Brace for impact." The flight attendants began the rhythmic, high-volume shouting. "Brace! Brace! Heads down! Stay down!" Passengers reacted in a variety of ways. Some prayed, some gripped the armrests, and some, like Jim Whittaker, reached out to help others, offering to hold a 9-month-old lap child for a trembling mother. The 208 seconds of the flight were coming to an end. Sullenberger aimed for a point near the ferry terminals, knowing rescue would be most likely there. He needed to keep the wings perfectly level and the nose at a specific pitch. Too low, and the aircraft would nosedive and break apart. Too high, and the tail would strike with such force that it would tear the fuselage open. 3:43 p.m. U.S. Airways Flight 1549 hit the Hudson River at 140 miles per hour. For the passengers, it was not a splash, but a violent, shuddering collision. The deceleration was so intense, some passengers felt their arms being driven back into their shoulders, resulting in fractures. The aircraft scooted along the surface before finally coming to a halt. The miracle was only beginning, and it was about to get much colder. The impact had torn a hole in the rear fuselage, and water began gushing in with terrifying speed. In the aft section, flight attendant Doreen Welsh was suddenly waist-deep in 36-degree water, her legs sliced open by a piece of the cabin floor. Panicked passenger opened a rear door, allowing the river to pour in even faster. Welsh began screaming for people to go over the seats as the aisle became impassable. As passengers exited onto the wings, they were met with the true brutality of the New York winter. The air was 19 degrees, and the wind whipped across the open river. The wings, slick with jet fuel, began to submerge as the tail sank. Passengers huddled together, standing in water that was cold enough to cause total incapacitation within minutes. Some, fearing an explosion, jumped into the river and swam toward anything that floated. But then, the second miracle happened. Within 3 minutes and 40 seconds of the impact, the Thomas Jefferson, a commuter ferry, arrived at the scene. Captain Vincent Lombardi had seen the plane descending and, without waiting for orders, turned his vessel toward the crash site. Soon, a whole fleet of ferries joined. The Governor Thomas Keane, the Moira Smith, the Yogi Berra. Ferry staff and deckhands began hauling shivering passengers aboard, even giving their own coats to those drenched in the icy water. Sullenberger, in accordance with the highest traditions of the sky, walked the cabin twice to ensure no one was left behind. He was the last person to leave the aircraft. By 3:55 p.m., only 25 minutes after the bird strike, every soul on board had been rescued from the water. But for many, the flight never really ended. While the media celebrated the miracle on the Hudson, the survivors were entering a different kind of storm. Patrick Harton, the controller, sat in a darkened room for hours, convinced he had just presided over a mass casualty event. He texted his wife, "Had a crash, not okay, can't talk now." When he finally learned everyone had survived, arrived, he couldn't shake the image of grieving widows every time he saw the survivors on television. Flight attendant Doreen Welsh suffered from panic attacks for months, triggered by something as simple as inhaling a little water in the shower. Passengers like Jorge Morgado found themselves unable to step onto a plane again, the metallic groaning of the impact forever etched into their memory. Sullenberger himself struggled with insomnia, weight loss, and the weight of the hero label. He famously told his co-pilot, "40 years of my flying experience will be judged on just 200 seconds of flight time." The investigation that followed was a grueling process that initially questioned Sullenberger's decision. Simulations suggested the plane could have made it back to an airport, but Sullenberger fought back, pointing out the human factor. When the NTSB added a 35-second delay to the simulations to account for the time it takes a human being to react to an unprecedented crisis, every single simulation resulted in a catastrophic crash into the city. The miracle was not just luck. It was the result of a pilot who knew when to trust his eyes over the instruments. Today, the plane, N106 US, sits in a museum, its fuselage bent but unbroken. It stands as a silent witness to the day the Hudson River became a runway. But the true legacy of Flight 1549 isn't found in the metal. It's found in the 155 people who went home that night. It's a story that reminds us of the thin line between a routine afternoon and a brush with eternity, and the extraordinary things that happen when humans choose to work together in the face of the impossible. As Sullenberger later observed, when we work together, when we remember our common humanity, there is little that we cannot accomplish. That is the miracle. Not just that they survived the water, but that they survived the aftermath, and that on a cold January day in New York, 155 people prove that even when everything goes wrong, there is still hope to be found in the freezing currents of the Hudson.